Welcome to Pressure Point. It's a privilege to welcome to our program Dr. Lois Wilson. Dr. Wilson, you are a past president of the Canadian Council of Churches, former moderator of the United Church of Canada, and now a president of the World Council of Churches. Welcome to Vancouver.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here. What are the duties of a president of the World Council of Churches?
Well, that's interesting you should ask, George, because I've just finished a document which I presented saying these shall be the duties of the presidents of the World Council of Churches. It's an office that has grown up like Topsy with no structure or really to it. But we, over the time that I've been president, since '83, we've gathered together and suggested a number of things. One is that the presidents be used as the public visible symbol of the world Christian community, because we are in fact drawn from 7 continents. Yeah. That on public occasions when the World Council is visible, such as the reception we were afforded by the President of the Soviet Union, that presidents should be presented as representatives of the community. We sometimes are asked to chair significant consultations. I was asked to chair one on the reunification of North and South Korea. And then we're asked sometimes to chair sessions at the Assembly, at the Central Committee, and for special things.
Your term only lasts between the councils from 83 to 91?
Don't say only, that's quite a long time.
Quite a lot, but I was wondering then about carryover in terms of...
No, there is none.
There is none?
No, but the term is 83 to 91.
Yeah.
And we are some of the few people who will be at both assemblies. We'll have been at Vancouver and we will be at Canberra.
I see. And then all of them change?
Yes.
All will be changed.
Yes.
Are you working apart from that, vocationally in the church?
Yes, I'm working under the McGeechee Senior Scholarship right now, which allows me, and I'm doing that 3/4 time, and I'm doing it to animate the church and work with groups around recasting the Bible stories for small children, informed by contemporary feminist scholarship.
Oh, that's great.
I'm having fun doing that.
That would be fun doing that.
Yes.
I had a chance to interview you back in 1983 at the World Council of Churches meeting in Vancouver. We had a Pressure Point program on the side, and I interviewed you. You were one of the delegates from the United Church of Canada. But this is different. Now you're in Vancouver flogging a book.
Yes.
Turning the World Upside Down, just published by Doubleday. And I really am glad to be able to say it is a very good book.
Oh, thank you. I hope it proves to be.
I've been wrestling with why it is, why it's different. And a member of our congregation came into my study this morning and sat down and said, I spent the weekend reading copies of the United Church Observer. When you think of the United Church Observer, what's one word that comes to mind? So I said, provocative. What word comes to your mind when you think of the United Church Observer? And he said, gloom and guilt. We get all of these different world issues that the Observer deals with, and when you're finished reading it, you feel hopeless and responsible. Now, your book deals with all of those things, but you don't come out of it with that sense of gloom or hopelessness or guilt. There's a kind of excitement and a kind of let's get at it nature about the book that's really worthwhile. Why is that?
Well, you see, that sense of hope and excitement was communicated to me by the people I have met. And I do travel a great deal, but nobody ever asks me what I do when I travel. So I thought, well, I think I would like to write about the people I meet when I travel and my work and the kind of hope that they've given me. And so I wrote about the base community of Catholics I met in Argentina, and the women in Uruguay who live in the slums, and the professors of South Korea who lost their jobs because of their stand on human rights, and the dancing that goes on in African churches, and the faithfulness of the Russians and the Chinese in situations of that are difficult. And they've given me hope, so I just wanted to pass that on.
Well, you've done that. When you talk about hope, Dr. Wilson, and you see hope in the different situations, like in the slums of Argentina, how can those people be hopeful? That is the question that our people would ask.
Oh, but you see, I mean, there's more hope there than there is in our society, because hope seems to be only known about by people who have passed through despair.
One of the very interesting phrases you use in the book is the spirituality of combat. I hadn't run into that one before. It's very evocative. Would you say a word concerning that?
Christians in Asia and Africa talk about the spirituality of combat. that is not a spirituality of retreat from the world, but a spirituality where one is fully engaged with the human issues, with what's happening to the human being. And they're the ones who talk about what is the content of the spirituality of combat. And, I think those two, and Frank Chicane also, who's with the South African Council of Churches, are using the Gandhian model of spirituality, which is a spirituality of combat. I mean, Gandhi provoked in order to allow his opposition to really save themselves.
Yes.
And that's what Bozak and Tutu and Chicane are doing also. They're allowing de Klerk to save his own humanity by releasing the 7 prisoners, by doing this, by announcing this.
There seems to be some hope in South Africa.
There's
in de Klerk?
Quite a few signs of hope.
Yes. Dr. Wilson, there are pictures in the book, and that's great to see some of your pictures. And the first picture is one of the pictures is of you as a young woman, 18, with a bicycle, on a mission field in Manitoba, covering 4 points on a charge and traveling 35 miles a Sunday on the bicycle.
Yes, at least.
That was great. On pasteurized roads. They would not always be covered with concrete and gravel.
Oh, no, they were all gravel or mud, and quite often I couldn't get my bike to go. And actually, that gave me the idea, so I rounded up all the kind of bachelors on that charge and afforded them the opportunity to sign up to drive me.
Oh, good.
On rainy days.
And good pastoral visitation opportunities
absolutely.
There, all the way through.
But that was the experience of that summer, which was purely accidental that I got there. It was post-war and there weren't enough men.
Yes.
So they would take anybody, they'd take women. And I enjoyed it so much that was a strong impetus to becoming an ordained minister for me.
Yes. At that time, did you have any idea of the kind of issues, concerns, and interests you would be getting into as your life went on?
No idea at all. It was a summer that I enjoyed, but I had no idea. In fact, at the time I thought I would like to be a physical education teacher, and my mother talked me out of it and said that was the time when, at age 30, if rigor mortis was setting in, you had no future. She said, oh, no, Lois, you shouldn't do that. Look at something a little longer.
Like marriage.
Exactly.
Like marriage,
exactly.
something a little longer.
So, no, I had no thoughts of... you see, there were very few women in ministry at that point. And
certainly no married women.
Oh, none at all.
None at all then?
That I knew of. There was... Alice Hogman was a year ahead of me. And she was ordained and then became married. And she advised me to do the same, but I didn't take her advice.
There's a quote in the book from J.R. Muchmore.
Yes,
I'll
never forget that one.
Was that real? Did he actually say that?
Oh, yes. That was in 1964, the year before I was ordained. My husband Roy was president of conference, and I was therefore sitting beside him at the banquet, that we have.
Yes.
And I asked him, and he, what do you think of me becoming ordained? Oh, he said, I think that's not a good idea. He says, there are 3 things. One, who will wear the pants, and who will get the car, and if both of you work in the same church, that would be a power block. And it was the 3rd one that I think may have held some water, but that was his advice to me. You see, the advice I got from most clergy, most of whom were male, was, no, you will be much better as a minister's wife.
Yes. Play the role of the minister's wife.
Yes.
And you see the world turning upside down in the last 25 years, particularly in terms of women's concerns in the United Church of Canada.
Yes.
Dr. Wilson, if I showed you an article from the Vancouver Sun that showed that there were 1,000 Anglican priests organizing into a community in England to block the ordination of women as priests in the Anglican Church, what would you say?
Oh, dear. I mean, my response is to laugh. That is totally out of date. It's totally irrelevant.
It really seems that way, doesn't it?
Well, and in the Anglican Communion, I mean, I was very proud of Primate Michael Pierce, who at the Lambeth Conference, when somebody said, our tradition does not allow the ordination of women priests, he said, well, our tradition in Canada is that we do, and we've been doing it for 12 years, and so today's practice becomes tradition, and so our tradition supports it. And I think that history is probably opposed to those 1,000 people who are opposing.
Yes.
That's
as you say, it seems really irrelevant.
Well,
in the
it's
present
very
day and age.
sad. It's very sad to not avail themselves of the gifts of half of the human race, too.
Let's work a bit at some of the concerns that you raise in the book. There's the women's issues, ecumenical relationships, poverty. ecumenical relations, how is that developing in Canada? The
But are you
ecumenical
talking about
relationships
church relationships?
between church relationships.
Interchurch only.
Interchurch only.
Oh, I think
We'll come
that's
to
settled
faith
down
issues
to a
before.
dull yawn in Canada.
Now, does that mean that dull yawn mean that they're pulling back their resources from the places where they have worked together before?
I think that some of that will happen shortly as budgets begin to shrink. And of course, one of the ways that we do ecumenical work in Canada is through the coalitions, as you know,
Yes.
Project Plowshares and the others. And their research and so on and their actions have been so strong that will be a great pity if their wings are cut.
I was aware of a meeting yesterday of the Committee on Human Rights in Latin America, and they were really concerned about their future, looking at possibility of the loss of funds from the different funding sources that have supported them.
I think we must be careful to preserve the cutting edges of the Christian community.
If that is a dull yawn, Dr. Wilson, how about not ecumenical relationships within the church, but ecumenical relationships in terms of world religions?
Well, I think that's quite a divisive issue right now, which interests me greatly, because people disagree about it. And they disagree, I think, partly on theological grounds. It calls into question a lot of the theology of mission, which has been traditional understandings within Christian community. The uniqueness of Jesus, the one-way theology.
Yes, the triumphalist point
Yes,
of view.
yes. And so that, for me, is a very interesting issue. And I think, particularly in Vancouver and Toronto, where there are substantive and large communities of Muslims, of Sikhs, of Jews, and so on, that's where that dialogue should be taking place.
Out of your experience, how can we relate to that dialogue in a positive kind of way?
Well, start, for one thing. I mean, start. One way, I think that for Christians there needs to be a fair amount of listening done. You know, after my trip in '75 when I went to India, and it was the first time I'd understood that Christians are a minority in that subcontinent and also in the world, when I came home I did some work to find out and make contact with the local Hindus and the Muslims in Hamilton. And at a congregational level, we invited them to a dialogue. I mean, we began to start. The first night we laid the ground rules that this was not about conversion, this was not about proselytism, this was not about trying to get you into my community.
And when you say that, Dr. Wilson, are you not ruling out some Christians? Are there Christians who will not enter the dialogue unless it deals with conversion?
Oh, yes. And so they ruled themselves out because we said in company with the others, these were the ground rules for our discussions. And those who wouldn't abide by the ground rules were not welcome. Then we began the talk, and for each of 4 nights, we did a show and tell. One was the Hindus' night, one was the Muslims' night, one was the Christians' night. And then that led on to inviting each other into each other's homes, you know, and that's dialogue on a different level. And then we went to each other's high and holy days. And one Christmas Eve, we had 2 rows of Muslims sitting there watching us at the Christmas Eve communion. And afterwards coming up and saying, you know, you were eating something, what was it? Tell us about that. Now, so that helped me excavate my own faith to try and communicate what that was about. So I did not feel threatened, and any time I've entered into dialogue it has helped me affirm and excavate my own understanding of Christian faith.
Did you feel the others felt threatened?
No, or they would not have come back.
Yes.
And there was no sense in which we said, now we all agree, after all, the same God. And so, I mean, we disagree on many things, and they're very important disagreements, and that has to be faced. But I think that that's the cutting edge of ecumenism in Canada. When you ask about ecumenical relationships, I was about to answer in terms of other faiths, because that's where I think the cutting edge is.
I agree, that's where the cutting edge is, that's where the future is, and that is going to raise the question with regard to authority and interpretation of Scripture
Exactly.
far more drastically in our church than even the issue with regard to the ordination of homosexual persons.
It will also raise the issue of did God so love the world, or did God so love the church? Like, which is the primary area of God's concern? And if it is the world, if it is our human community, then that's where we should be putting our resources of love and grace.
You have, since Crete, learned about and been deeply involved in the whole matter of poverty and our response to poverty?
More in Latin America.
Don't you find in places like India just a terrible sense of hopelessness?
Well, feel a certain amount of despair and more anger than hopelessness. I mean, anger that so few people really care a fig about it. You know, if I'm okay, then what's that got to do with me? As though we live in separate worlds. And we don't. I mean, the world is very small. And what happens in one part affects the other. And it's the same kind of anger I feel in Canada when I talk with Native people.
Yeah.
I think the third world is here as well as there. And it is not a geographic place. And we know it in Canada as well. And we need to internalize that, because if we think of it only as happening in Latin America or someplace else, it's very easy to say, oh, well, you know, they haven't got their act together, or why don't they work the way we do, or why don't they pull themselves up by their bootstraps or something else, again, as though it is all their fault.
Yeah.
But to understand in the Canadian context, we know that the issue with Native people is not that simple.
No.
It's very complex, and you people in BC should know that especially.
How can we respond? How can we respond when we see two such revered persons as Jean Vanier and Mother Teresa deeply disagreeing over what the response should be?
Well, I think the churches have moved a fair way in response. I mean, Mother Teresa was, if they're hungry, feed them a fish, feed them for a day. And Jean Vanier's was, but why don't you help them how to cut a fishing rod, and which is a legitimate response for some others who are able to do that. But as we found out in Northern Ontario, the English river system was polluted, so when they caught the fish, they had mercury poisoning and nobody could eat the fish. So one has to stop the upstream pollution, which I think the church is beginning to understand now. And even beyond that, if you catch so many fish, you can only eat so many. And what in fact you may need are some vegetables, so you need to get into the market economy somehow and know how to do that. And the church has moved into that a little bit. I mean, I saw some very good models in Nicaragua, for example, where our church was funding small business. A man who'd started a motorcycle repair shop, a woman who was a seamstress and was working with 7 other friends in a small business to really be able to sustain themselves. So I think that in small ways the church is providing some good initiatives there.
There's a place in your book where you use something that really would frighten a lot of people. This discussion of prostitution in the Philippines, and you use this sentence: people are afraid to turn the world's economic system upside down, to change it, to help others. Some people are threatened by a thought like that.
Well, I don't know why it would. I mean, in the first place, prostitution has economic roots. I mean, if women, not many of the prostitutes I know are doing it because they love doing it, but in fact it's a way of earning a living. I mean, and certainly many in the Philippines some were putting themselves through university, and some were supporting their families out in the rural areas where, because of the economic system, they were not able to earn a living. And I'm not an economist, but it seems to me that because of the results of the present systems we have, there has to be some major adjustments made. And I don't think economic systems are sacrosanct. I think they were put in place by people and they can be changed by people.
I thought that I would just throw some names or some words at you and let you respond to those to give folk an idea of what's in the book and some of the ideas that are there. China.
Well, China, that's K.H. Ding. K.H. Ding was the secretary of the World Student Christian Federation when I was a student in university. And we used to receive these visitors from time to time. And I can remember clearly a conversation I had with him in, 1947, I think, in which he said, "Lois, what are you going to do with your life?" And I said, "I'm going to get married." He said, no, that doesn't answer the question. What are you going to do with your life? And I said, "You mean I got to do something else?" I mean, it was the first time that I thought that there would be another role for me. And his wife, Sui Mei, said, yes, in China, all women think that. And I've discovered in North America that you don't. It's a terrible waste of people. Now, that was 47. My own children find difficulty in believing that conversation ever took place. But in fact, it was the social context of the time. I've been in touch and been interested to follow K.H.'s ministry all those years. He's an Anglican, an Anglican bishop, and he's now the president of the China Christian Council, and also one of the authorities in the Three Self movement of China, and was recently appointed to the People's Consultative Committee, which is related to the government. So he's a key person. In the years of the revolution in 1950, all his colleagues advised him against going back to China because they said, you know, there's no future for a Christian in a communist country with Mao's revolution. But he went, and he's lived his life there. And it's interesting now what's happening to the churches in China. They have insisted that this time round, I think this is the fourth or fifth try, that the Christian faith in China will be in Chinese cultural terms. It has always been known as a Western religion, and the common thing was one more Christian means one less Chinese. Terrible thing to say. Yeah. And so they're working very hard to express it in Chinese cultural terms. For example, in the Nanjing Theological College, the students study not only theology, but study traditional Chinese art forms, which is paper cutting. And so you can buy in the stores there not only lovely bamboo scenes and mountains and streams in the traditional art form, but also the Good Samaritan, the woman in the well, and they've put gospel themes into the culture through the art in order to inform the culture. And I think that's a splendid initiative. When I was there with a number of theological students in '87, and when we asked, what can we do to help? One of them said, perhaps with tongue-in-cheek, what you can do is come to church on Sunday, put a lot of money on the offering plate, and then go home.
Oh, that's good. And a name that comes out of China, James Endicott.
Oh, yes, well, James Endicott, of course, took quite a different view than the United Church in 1950 around the revolution. And as a result, I mean, he supported the revolution because, in fact, it was for the life of the people. It overturned the very corrupt Chiang Kai-shek regime. And he saw it as a positive thing. And the United Church of Canada didn't. And he finally resigned from ministry over that issue. When I was moderator was when the United Church reinstated James Endicott, as though he needed to be reinstated. But I did get to make the call to him to say, please, Jim, will you come? And all is forgiven.
That was in Montreal?
Yes, in Montreal.
Was that in Montreal?
Well, I mean, to our credit, we did try to correct that historical mistake.
And learn from the past mistakes.
And learn from that, I hope.
Yes. How about Corazine Aquino?
Well, Corazine Aquino, I have a memory of her because she was on television today in Vancouver. She's visiting here. But incidentally, when we were driving to this interview, we passed the place where I remember Madame Marcos came on the same mission about 10 years ago. She came to drum up trade for the Philippines. And at that time, the urban-rural mission people in Canada, which is one of our coalitions, were picketing Madame Marcos, and I joined their demonstration. It's one of the first times I had. And one of them said, here, we'll look after your purse, and here, you join. Because Madame Marcos had just finished moving, clearing out a whole group of squatters, of the poor, from Manila Beach in order to put up big tourist high-rises for rich American and Japanese tourists, and had done this without consultation and, in fact, bulldozed them out, and that's why we were demonstrating.
Dr. Wilson, are you saying that Corazine Aquino has become much the same as Imelda Marcos?
Well, Aquino is known by the Canadian Nation Working Group, which is the ecumenical church coalition, which includes the Philippines. She has done nothing on land reform, which is the key problem in the Philippines. She, I understand, owns a fair amount of land herself, and although there is the facade of democracy, she has done nothing about the basic issue. And so she's very much under attack. And I think this visit is picketed by that same coalition who are saying we want the human rights issues in the Philippines to looked at before we begin to trade with that country. And I support that point of view.
Dr. Wilson, one of the images you use in the book is the image of opening your files and emptying your files that we might read them and learn from them. Are there new files there that haven't been opened that you will be opening in the future?
No, I think I've unpacked most of them, but there will be others in the future. You see, I haven't unpacked the ecology file, and it's just beginning to get rather large.
Yes.
That one's beginning to come on the horizon. And one of my questions is, how do these things come about? I mean, how do new issues and concerns come into public consciousness? And I don't know. how did the whole consciousness about social justice come about? How did the feminist movement begin? What about the peace movement? How did that arise and gather its strength? And where did the ecological movement start? And where is it gaining its strength? And more importantly, what is still on the horizon?
Yes, and one of the questions when you look at that and other things, when you pick up something, you have to drop something else?
Not necessarily, though. Not necessarily, because I think that many of the issues of our world are interdependent issues. You may not give the same emphasis to some of the ones before, but I don't think I've ever dropped an issue. You simply integrate it into new learnings. And so I wonder what's on the horizon. And I think for Christians, one must always be open to the future in the sense to allow the Spirit to,
That's right.
to inform. And I can hardly wait to find out what the next one's going to be.
One of the things we will all be looking forward to is that book you're doing for children with regard to the Bible and with a background of feminist theology. That will be very interesting.
But I'm hoping that won't be written by me. That will be hopefully produced by people from across the country who are concerned that the insights of feminist scholarship be made known to their children in the way Bible stories are told to them before they're age 6. So I'm hoping that'll be an anthology, tapes, video, whatever. But it'll be exciting.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Wilson, it's been really worthwhile to talk to you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for sharing this time with us on Pressure Point. My name is George Searcy. Good to be with you.